Evening. We're going to begin tonight with random terror and its after effects. When a single individual pulled out a handgun last night and began to kill people on a commuter train making its way out of New York City, this city certainly gasped and said, "Not again." And in other parts of the country, when people heard that 5 had been murdered and 20 others injured on the train, a very broad reaction seemed to be, "Is any place safe in this day and age?" He was quite methodical. He killed, he reloaded, and he killed again.
The fact that Colin Ferguson was a ticking time bomb was apparent to everyone.
Hey, welcome back to Winter Brothers Stories. So I know it's been a while. I had to take some time to focus on some other things, but I'm back and I'll be looking to upload more often. All right, thanks for sticking with me. Anyhow, in the news lately, there's been this story of Daryl Brooks. Have you seen this? Black man found guilty of running over pedestrians at an annual Christmas parade. So this story picked up a lot more steam because Daryl Brooks in court antics, which were, just off the wall crazy. He was representing himself, and it reminded me of a story from back in the 90s of Colin Ferguson. All right, so he was a black man also who in the 1990s boarded the Long Island Railroad, and he just opened fire indiscriminately on the passengers of the train. And he went on to also represent himself in a way that was so over the top that it even stole some attention from the O.J. Simpson trial that started one day apart. The Colin Ferguson trial was immortalized by Saturday Night Live back in January 1995, when they were still funny. If you haven't seen it, their cold opening on this was freaking hilarious. All right, I'll provide a link in the description along with all my sources for the video. But when you're done watching this video, check that out because it's a good laugh. Also, when I was researching this video, I would find myself in the comment sections, as we all do. And I was amazed to see a real diversity of opinions on them. So I know it's the internet and I shouldn't be surprised that there's some real shitty takes out there. But there's people out there that are literally saying Colin Ferguson, the mass shooter, was an American hero and proclaiming his sainthood. It's bonkers. All right, so Colin Ferguson, this is the same man who got in a fist fight with serial killer Joe Rifkin, arguing over who was the better murderer. Yeah, so, this is crazy. I promise this is going to be an interesting story. Try to watch to the end. If you like it, give me a thumbs up on it. Try to comment. It really helps. Anyhow, let's get into it. Colin Ferguson was born in Kingston, Jamaica on January 14, 1958. His father, Von Herman, was a wealthy pharmacist and the managing director of a very large pharmaceutical company. Time magazine would later describe the father as one of the most prominent businessmen of Jamaica. Jamaica in the time of Colin's youth was seeing historical changes. The island was under British rule and the local population resented this and wanted their freedom. A counterculture also built up around this idea of independent Jamaica became the dominant culture. We see this in the Rastafari movement and black nationalism. Just like in America in the 1960s, we see on the island of Jamaica that there was a unified student and radical movement to change how the poor and the underrepresented lived. The politics of 1960s Jamaica could be a video unto itself. But the takeaway here is that mainstream culture was being saturated with extreme left and extreme right politics. Now, the clash between these opposed sides did meet in the middle with one thing: independence. The United Kingdom was no longer the world power it once was pre-World War II, and they were losing the iron grip on their colonies. And in August of 1962, Jamaica narrowly voted their way to freedom. Now, for our story, Colin Ferguson, it's important to note that a young Ferguson would have been exposed to the black nationalism ideas of the time. However, there's nothing to indicate that Colin adopted these views at the time. He would, as an adult, adopt a very extreme version of it. Colin Ferguson and his 4 brothers were children during this historical change. And while most of the country's population was struggling, this was far from the case for the Ferguson family. The Ferguson lived in abject luxury, and they were part of the elite. The family had a 2-story home that comfortably housed the 6 Fergusons that made up the family. it included their live-in nanny and a housekeeper. To me, it's like the Brady Bunch if it took place on a beautiful tropical island. Colin would attend the exclusive Calabar High School, which still to this day sits on 60 acres of lush and scenic lands and produced at least 5 Rhodes Scholars. The all-male school was founded by an English Baptist missionary. The high school was very exclusive, and it prepped many of the elite children of the island to go on to higher education. Colin would excel in this setting, playing cricket and soccer. The principal would later describe him as a well-rounded student. So, on a side note, isn't it amazing that the neighbors, the principals, all these people that know these monsters, they always come up with a way to say something to the sort of, they were just normal people, despite there always being some sort of sign that they were monsters. Well, it's just something I noticed. Anyhow, back to the story. In 1974, Colin graduated from Calabar, and his privileged life was moving along nicely. Until 1978, that is. And in 1978, Von Herman, his father, tragically died in a car crash. Von Herman was a pillar of this community, and as such, his funeral was attended by the upper echelon of Jamaican society, including high-level government and military personnel. Many would note that it was at this pivotal moment that cracks in Colin's personality began to appear. Now, Colin adored his father, and he wanted nothing more than his approval. And it wasn't too long after this tragic death that Colin's mother was diagnosed and succumbed to cancer in a rather quick succession. The 2 deaths destroyed the family's fortune, and a 23-year-old Colin, who never wanted or struggled for anything in his life, was suddenly thrown into a world he was ill-prepared for. Personally, I'd like to know how the family's money disappeared so quickly after his death, but I've yet to find a source that would properly explain it, because it's not normal for a well-to-do family like this to go broke unless the father didn't save and was living beyond his means, which could also maybe, explain some of what's going to happen as well. Either way, no matter how you split it, the tragic deaths of his parents, the loss of their family's wealth, mixed with mental illness, set the stage for what was to come next, and we're just at the very beginning of a downward spiral. The year is now 1982, and Colin made the unexpected move to the United States. He settled in New York, and while on a visitor's visa, which wouldn't allow someone to work here legally, Colin would struggle to find a job. He couldn't find anything but menial jobs, and he would tell friends he was being held back due to racism. This was becoming a common scapegoat at this time for his shortcomings. In his mind, the fact that he was illegally overstaying on a visitor's visa obviously, had no bearing on his ability to find meaningful work. Let's step back for a second. It can be hard enough to find a job as a U.S. citizen in your early 20s, especially if you factor in that person has no college education, no technical training, but Colin Ferguson was incapable of looking inwards for his faults. Moving forward, 1986, Colin met Audrey Warren. She was an American citizen of Jamaican descent, and they married on May 13th, 1986. And this marriage actually gave him the ability to become a permanent United States resident, so now he could legally work. Colin and his bride Audrey moved to the suburbs on Long Island, and this should have been a shining chance for Colin to turn his life around. However, 2 short years later, Audrey Warren obtained an uncontested divorce. The divorce came after months of bitter and often violent fighting. The police were regularly at the home due to the volatile nature of Colin Ferguson. Ultimately, the divorce paperwork would cite different social views. Whatever the reasons, the friends of the couple said it was a crushing blow to Colin. Colin had grandiose ideas about himself and his worth, and the divorce was more than he could mentally handle. Still, Colin would soldier on, and as most narcissists do, he would find fault in others before ever looking inward. She didn't leave him because he was violent, antagonistic. No. They divorced because she didn't see the world the way he did. In early August 1989, Colin began working for a Demco security group in Syosset, Long Island. He would do clerical work for the group, and on the 18th of August, during his normal routine, he fell from a stool. He would claim that this injured his head, neck, and back. Now, whatever the truth of the matter, he was terminated from this job shortly after. The New York State Workers' Compensation Board, which is notoriously slow due to bureaucracy, would review the matter. This incident would play a key role in the shooting later on, and it was a key part of his delusion. He felt that the New York State Workers' Compensation Board was out to get him. Colin would then enroll in a community college on Long Island. Despite excelling and making the dean's list 3 times, he was ultimately forced out of the college when he acted out in an aggressive manner with one of his teachers. A pattern is emerging, but let's continue on to see what happens. Next, he transferred to Adelphi University, again on Long Island, where he majored in business administration. It was around this time that Colin would publicly speak out against black people coexisting with white people. He was especially vocal about the need for a violent revolution. He would interrupt one professor who was teaching about South Africa with an outburst of, "Kill everybody who's white," threatening them and then saying the black revolution is going to get you. He would call the teacher an Uncle Tom. Considering this was coming from one man, it truly seems his delusion of grandeur were growing. This 1991 incident ended in the suspension from yet another college. In fact, I have a clip from that professor. Let's see what he has to say on the situation.
Disagreed with him, then he would associate you with racists. That, oh yeah, you are agreeing with racists, that's why you don't want to agree with me.
So we can see that Colin's becoming more and more delusional. It was around this time that he would tell his landlord, "I'm such a great person. There must be only one thing holding me back. It must be white people." In August 1991, he was living in Brooklyn, New York, and at the same time, the Crown Heights riots would take place 2 miles from his home. It's worth noting that these riots stem from an incident where 2 young black children were hit by a car driven by a Jewish man. There were wildly differing accounts of what exactly happened, but it's agreed upon that a riot broke out because of a perceived racist indifference.
CBS 2's political reporter Marsha Kramer takes a look back at how what then Mayor David Dinkins called the city's gorgeous mosaic came apart.
Crown Heights was on fire. The looting, rioting, and violence that started on the night of August 19, 1991 would go on for 4 long days, injuring more than 150 cops and 38 civilians, and creating 2 martyrs, one black, the other Jewish. 7-year-old Gavin Cato and 29-year-old rabbinical student Yankel Rosenbaum.
They were, people struggling to live side by side.
All the things that had been happening in that community exploded that night. Burning of buildings, turning over cars, beating just anybody that they could get in their hand.
Then Dinkins commissioner dispatched to the community, and Yoni Rosenbaum mourning the loss of his uncle. 3 people among many who still find the riots and what happened over the course of those 4 days hard to understand. It started as an accident. A car in the motorcade of the Lubavitcher Grand Rebbe ran a red light and crashed into a building at the corner of Utica Avenue and President Street, hitting Gavin Cato and his cousin Angela.
They didn't take care of the children. They leave the children on the ground and take care of the drivers and the passengers from the car.
Gavin Cato's father talking about the spark, the misinformation, the rumor that touched off the violence. His response that at first was inadequate, and charges that since he went to Gavin Cato's funeral and not Yankel Rosenbaum's, he did visit Rosenbaum in the hospital before he died, that he was biased. Dinkins was furious.
I held his hand, he held mine, he looked up in my eyes, I looked at him, we talked to one another. The compassion and concern was demonstrated, and the fact that I was not there at 8 o'clock this morning in no way diminishes the concern that I have.
Now, the riots lasted 3 days and became a very contentious political point in New York City politics. There's an obvious parallel to our story with Colin Ferguson. He didn't come up with this black revolution idea in a vacuum, and these views were obviously prevalent in his neighborhood. Unfortunately, his fragile mental state, combined with the atmosphere of the violence and hate, would amplify everything for him. "1992 was a seminal year for Colin. He had been divorced for 6 years at this point, but ex-wife Audrey Warren filed a complaint with the police alleging that he had used a crowbar to pry open the trunk of her car. They hadn't seen each other in 6 years since the divorce, but Colin had obviously not forgotten her. I wasn't able to find anything more on the incident, but I would imagine that it was a really scary event for her. These were the days before Facebook and the internet, where you could find out what an old friend or lover was doing with a click of the button. So it's not said, but I think it's implied that he was stalking his ex. February 1992. Colin was sitting on a subway when a white woman sat in the vacant seat next to him. Colin began by asking the woman to move, but he quickly escalated by pressing his legs and elbows into her and then ultimately striking her when she didn't yield to his request. Ladies, on a side note, I get wanting to stand up for yourself, but there's some crazies out there. Maybe, just maybe, it's best to move along when a crazy does something like this. Anyhow, the police were called, and Colin tried to make a dashing escape, all the while yelling to a group of unrelated African-American men, "Brothers, help me!" The police would quickly pin Colin to the ground and arrest him. And for his part, he would write letters to the police commissioner and other officials decrying the arrest as vicious and racist. The New York City Transit Authority, who held jurisdiction over the subway, investigated the arrest and dismissed the claims as unfounded. So, important to note, we weren't there. We can't get a copy of the arrest report. I would assume that this is the truth, but even giving him the benefit of the doubt, it doesn't excuse what he would later go on to do. 1992 was obviously shaping up to be a terrible year and a string of terrible years for the now 34-year-old Jamaican immigrant. However, not all was lost, because in September of 1992, Colin was awarded $26,000 from his workers' compensation claim against the Ademco security group. This vindicated that his claim that he did get hurt, and it should have been avoided and he should have been paid out. In today's money, that $26,000 would be the equivalent of $65,000. It's a pretty sizable sum and could open doors and change things for anyone who is struggling in life. By April 1993, Colin insisted he was still in pain and demanded that the case be reopened so he could get more money for treatment. However, he wouldn't let any of the state's approved doctors examine him because their names sounded too, quote-unquote, ethnic and not black enough. Colin would contact a Manhattan lawyer, Laura Apperson, and Lauren would recount the story, saying that she immediately felt uncomfortable in Colin's presence. Although Colin was dressed impeccably, his demeanor was hostile, and he provided a fake name at first. Miss Apperson, the lawyer, for the first time in her career, asked another associate to sit in on the conversation, feeling that something just wasn't right. When the attorney would later turn down Colin's request, he would lean in on his normal, aggressive behavior. He would leave threatening phone calls. He would boldly claim they were discriminating against him. In one of the calls, he made a reference to a California shooting, which was for decades the worst mass shooting in the state. After the Workers' Compensation Board rejected his claim, they too received threatening calls and letters. In response, the attorney and the Workers' Compensation Board added new security measures, all due to Colin Ferguson's increasing hostilities and frightening letters. The board even added Colin to a short list of dangerous people that security was supposed to be on the lookout for. At the same time of all this, Colin did what many before him have done when they find themselves stuck. He moved clear across the country to sunny California in search of a new career. Colin applied and was passed over by numerous jobs, but the one that sticks out the most is when he applied to a car wash and the manager just straight out laughed at him. During his stay in California, he went to Turner's Outdoorsman in Long Beach, and he bought a Ruger P89 9mm pistol for $400. In California, there was a 15-day wait period, and he used his newly acquired California driver's license to show proof of residence. The address on the driver's license was linked to a Long Beach motel he was staying at, far from what the law would call residency. But Colin was always right, and he was always above the law. This same pistol that he bought in California, somewhat legally, would be 100% illegal in New York. At this point, New York had a 100-year-old law that meant that you had to go to the police and show reason to have that pistol. So the minute he transported it back to New York, it became an illegal pistol. Not long after he bought the handgun, Colin claimed to be jumped and robbed at gunpoint by two African-American males. And it wasn't long after that, he began carrying his new handgun in a paper bag everywhere he went. 1 month after moving to California, Colin packed up and moved back to New York City in his old Flatbush apartment. However, he was obviously unraveling at this point. The Flatbush apartment was small, $175 a month for a tiny room that had a communal bathroom for all the neighbors. Patrick Dennis, the longtime landlord, welcomed Colin back, but immediately became alarmed. Neighbors said they could hear him talking in the showers. He would take showers 5 times a day, all the while chanting over and over again, "All the black people killing all the white people," over and over and over again. Colin would openly, at all times, obsess over perceived racism, and it became his whole persona. There was no constructive criticism, no activism. This was just an overt obsession, and it was clear to everyone that Colin was losing his grip on reality. Dennis asked him to move out at the end of the month, which brings us to the summer of 1993. It's suspected that around this time is when he started writing a list of enemies, a list that would be found on him at the scene of his crime. Among them were people of white and Asian descent, teachers from his time at Adelphi, and the state's compensation board also made his list. He would also oddly list Mayor David Dinkins as one of his friends, despite never meeting the mayor in any capacity. He held the first black mayor, David Dinkins, in very high regard, and would even consider him when planning his shooting. But more on that later. Not a lot is known publicly about what Colin Ferguson did between the time of being kicked out of his apartment in June 1993 and December 1993, but what we do know is that Colin Ferguson believed that his second request for more money from the Workers' Compensation Board would yield a second windfall. His own writings stated that he believed it would be reopened on Friday, December 3rd, 1993. He believed this despite his refusal to see the doctors and despite his refusal to follow the needed steps. Colin believed his case would prevail. These were not the thoughts of a rational man. Instead, on the day of December 3rd, he received the news that his second claim was rejected due to his own actions. December 7th, 1993, less than a week later, Colin boarded the third car of a train that was heading out of New York City. He boarded in Brooklyn, which is part of the greater New York City and was under Mayor Dinkins' jurisdiction. He carried a canvas bag with 160 rounds of 9mm Black Talon hollow point ammo. Hollow points are known for the expansion that happens when the bullet hits its target. The bullet would open like a razor-sharp flower and cause more damage to the internal organs. Contrary to urban legend, it doesn't have armor-piercing capabilities, but it's extraordinarily lethal nonetheless. Sitting in the packed commuter train, Colin Ferguson would wait for the train to leave Brooklyn, then Queens. If Colin was having second thoughts on this hour-long ride, you would never know it, as he sat stone-faced, waiting for his opportunity to start what he believed to be the Black Revolution. The first stop, that was officially out of New York City, and more important to Colin, out of Mayor Dinkins' district, would be Maryland Avenue. He didn't want there to be any blowback on the first black mayor. It also happened to be the last stop on a crowded 5:33 p.m. commuter train. The third car was packed as usual, and 80 people filled all the seats, and some were sitting in the open area by the doors, eager to go home after a long day of work. No one was aware of the violence that would come to punctuate the mundane commute home. As the train slowly approached Maryland Avenue, Colin stood up, he drew his handgun, and opened fire. Panic would ensue. Colin, coldly and with no reservations, would make his way up the aisles, and one by one, he would point, aim, and squeeze the trigger. Some would describe his demeanor as no different than the ticket collectors who also slowly walked the aisles in this same fashion. He was able to empty 2 15-round magazines during the spree. There was some luck, however. As he began loading the third, someone yelled, "Grab him!" Passengers Michael O'Connor, Kevin Blum, and Market McTenney answered this call and tackled and pinned him to the seat. The deafening sound of the handgun in that small enclosed cart, the horrific sounds of frightened people. 6 lay dead, 19 others were hit, shot, and 2 passengers were badly injured in a stampede of terrified commuters trying to exit. Yet, these 3 heroes came together to ensure Colin Ferguson would not harm anyone else. An off-duty Long Island Railroad police officer, Andrew Roderick, would then board the train and cuff the monster. When making this video, I really wanted to convey the seriousness of the crime. The fact that there's a shooting every other week can sometimes desensitize us and make it harder to empathize with the victims. I would like to read Kevin Blum's retelling. He is one of the first of the 3 guys who tackled and penned Colin Ferguson. If you're sensitive to situational terror like this, I'll leave a timestamp to skip ahead. It will not be gory, but nonetheless, be warned. Kevin Blum was already standing near the rear exit doors. His destination, Garden City's Maryland Avenue station, was 1 stop away. Blum had just set his suitcase on the ground when he heard 3 loud bangs. At first, I thought it was a firecracker, Blum recalled, and then somebody yelled out, "He's shooting!" Blum crouched down in the vestibule. The gunman, who Blum couldn't see, kept firing. Blum counted the shots, expecting the gunman to run out of bullets. 7, 8, 9, 10. It turned out Ferguson was carrying a 9mm Ruger, which comes equipped with a 15-round clip. 11, 12, 13. Finally, the shooting stopped. An eerie silence took hold of the car. Then Blum heard someone whisper, "He's reloading." Kevin Blum ran down the aisle away from the gunman. He was a few steps from the train doors at the front of the car when gunshots rang out again. 2 or 3 people had climbed on top of one another in the vestibule. Blum settled himself onto the pile and curled out into a fetal position. The gunfire was not as rapid before. Blum knew what that meant. The shooter was now methodically taking out passengers. Convinced he was going to be shot, Blum spread out his arms and legs, enveloping the people beneath him. The thought came to me, if I'm going to get shot, I might as well make myself big, so maybe I'll take the bullets and the other people won't, he recalled. Then Blum's thoughts drifted to his wife, Suzanne, and their 4 children, ages 3, 9, 12, and 14. The shots were getting closer and closer. This isn't the way to go, Blum said to himself. The gunshots suddenly sounded as if they were further away, and Blum heard a voice in his head. "It's gonna be okay." It was almost like an angel was on my shoulders, he recalled. Blum stood and saw Ferguson, his 2 hands gripping his gun, shoot at a woman cowering in her seat. Then he pivoted toward Blum, and the man's eyes met. They were about 6 rows away from each other. The 6-foot, 200-pound Blum charged, holding his briefcase in the center of the aisle like a matador. His timing was impeccable. Out of bullets, with no time to reload, Ferguson dropped his pistol. Blum shoved him into a seat and got on top of him, burying his knee in Ferguson's groin. 2 men, Mark McKenty and Michael O'Connor, were right behind Blum and helped him pin down Ferguson. "Don't hurt me," Ferguson squealed, and the train pulled into the Maryland Avenue station, and a Long Island Railroad cop cuffed Ferguson. It was no time to celebrate. 6 people were dead. Richard Nettleton, 24 years old, Amy Federici, 27 years old, Mi Kang Kim, 27 years old, Teresa Marita Magtoto, 30 years old, James Gorgaki, 51, and McCarthy, 52. Ferguson's trial turned into a circus. The unhinged Brooklyn man defended himself, leading to a series of bizarre and heated courtroom exchanges with many of the people he shot 13 months earlier. Ferguson would play the role of attorney and looked the part, and sounded the part, and maybe, in a different life, he could have became a lawyer, but in his trial, he would often talk about himself in third person, all the while terrorizing his victims a second time. I'm going to play a few clips so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about, because it's surreal and it's hard to describe. Here we are, roll the clip.
Ferguson seems to try at least one witness's patience.
Did there come a time when you heard a pop?
Yeah, when you got up out of your seat.
Who did you see shot first?
I saw someone, you, shoot someone to the north side of the train, which is your left.
Is it your testimony under Mr. Peck's questioning that you saw no one shot?
I saw you shooting everyone on the train, okay?
This was important for me to do.
It was good to get in there and definitely let him know that I saw you do this.
The greatest part of my life in this past year, to look him in the eyes again, under my terms. And I was in control of it.
It's good for me to do it.
I got him nervous this time, and he was the one who was nervous. And I'm so happy.
I am proceeding according to my constitutional right to defend myself.
Ferguson did not immediately avail himself of that right. Civil rights lawyers William Kunstler and Ronald Kuby stepped forth to represent Ferguson shortly after the shooting on the train.
Defense in Colin Ferguson's case was always the insanity defense.
But Kunstler and Kuby added a racial twist.
You had a man with an unstable psyche and a pre-existing mental illness who was repeatedly exposed to racism day in, day out, year after year, and that finally broke him. And in that moment of madness, in that black rage, he went out and massacred that train full of people.
Pollsters found this defense, quickly dubbed the Black Rage defense, made sense to 45% of whites and 60% of blacks polled. But Ferguson decided he was not an appropriate candidate for any kind of insanity defense.
Colin Ferguson ultimately rejected the insanity defense because Colin Ferguson was convinced that he wasn't insane. Everybody else was crazy, not Colin Ferguson.
Ferguson fired Kunstler and Kuby after they urged the court to reevaluate his competency for trial. Ferguson decides he'll represent himself at trial.
I mean, the problem in this case wasn't that Colin Ferguson was representing himself. The problem in the case is that Colin Ferguson was a delusional psychotic, and his defense was a product of mental illness, his arguments were a product of mental illness, and ultimately the whole trial became a product of the intersection of Colin Ferguson's mental illness and the prosecutor's own ambition.
Prosecutor George Peck, for whatever reason, did insist Ferguson was a sane man who should be brought to trial. Peck, who is now a judge in Nassau County, chose not to speak with Court TV.
Detective Avendandelo, would it be fair to say that during interrogation at headquarters, you discovered that an agency of the federal government was attempting to frame Mr. Ferguson?
Sustained.
Next, Ferguson says he'd like to subpoena President Clinton.
He has said that Mr. President Clinton has had conversations with persons who receive congressional medals coming out of the Long Island Railroad massacre. And therefore these persons might have divulged to President Clinton certain information which they have not told to the court. So he probably wanted to get that type of information from the president.
The jury deliberates for just one day.
Murder in the second degree. What is your verdict?
Guilty.
As to count 3, murder in the second degree. What is your verdict?
Guilty.
As to count 31, attempted murder in the second degree. What is your verdict?
Guilty.
As to count 60, attempted murder in the second degree. What is your verdict?
Guilty.
That's it.
You know, didn't get emotional, but tonight, goddammit, I am very emotional.
Some of the most dramatic moments in the case of State versus Colin Ferguson occur after the verdict.
Colin Ferguson was found guilty of 6 counts of murder, 22 counts of attempted murder, and he received a 315-year sentence, which ensured Colin Ferguson will never be a free man. He would later argue in his appeals that he had an incompetent counsel, which of course was him since he represented himself. Ferguson has been in numerous altercations since being jailed. There's of course the famous one where Ferguson and serial killer Joel Rifkin got into a fistfight. They're conflicting accounts, but it seems there was an argument started over a phone and it quickly escalated into who was the better murderer. Ferguson would also be jumped in Nassau County Jail while on trial. He would suffer a broken nose and swollen eyes. Colin Ferguson was a sick man, and he needed help. There were many African-American allies in his corner that tried to help him. They tried to talk to him and guide him, but ultimately therapy would have been needed, something he never got before jail. Since being in prison, Colin Ferguson has said he hopes to disappear into the oblivion so as not to be remembered. But of course, we will not let this happen because his victims should never be forgotten. Thank you for watching. My name is Zach Winters, making up half the Winter Brothers stories. And as always, if you could give a like, comment, and maybe share this video with someone who may enjoy, it's truly appreciated. I'll be working on another video shortly and can't wait to see you all again. Bye.